When you see a female carrying this much muscle mass this easily, it's less likely that she's natural and more likely that she's depending on some sort of exogenous support.
Disclaimer, this video is educational and informative in nature. Do not contact anyone shown in this video. Also, this video is discussing steroids.
Do not use steroids.
This is entirely for educational and entertainment purposes only.
No one likes a big, fat, liar, pants on fire, especially when they're trying to sell you something, for example, supplements. In the fitness industry, you see this a lot, claiming supplements basically do incredible things, change people's physiques in exceptional ways, and build copious amounts of strength. All the meanwhile, when you buy them using a fancy-dancy discount code, you ultimately don't get those same effects. And it's probably because, the influencer's trying to sell you on the idea that this supplement is the bee's knees, that is silently injecting and or orally administering a shit ton of steroids. You see, the problem is the incentive can be quite high to claim natural because you place better in shows. There's less legal friction. You sell more products because obviously it's not taking steroids, so what you're using has to work really, really well to make you look that way. That is the pitch that you're selling to people. Then on top of that, you also have this unspoken sort of moral high ground because you chose the better path. You didn't do the shortcut that everyone else is taking. You stayed natural and built muscle over time and did it all with just good grit and willpower. However, it gets odd, frankly, because at this point in our timeline of events and fitness and everything else, I don't think people really give a shit these days. Caring about whether you're natural or not really isn't that big of an issue. It's much less important than just having, for example, an honesty policy where you, explain the fact that you may actually not be natural in some instances. So let's just move all that aside and take a deep dive here into a gal's profile named Hannah. Now, in her bio, she says that she is completely natural and competes in natural federations, which is impressive. But let's just take an honest look at things. I want you to be a skeptic here, okay? Put yourself into a skeptic's shoe as we go through this profile. All right, so straight away, if this is natural, the world has to be flat. Everything I know is false. Like, the entire reality that I have built on my entire understanding of life is just been a lie. Because never in my life have I ever seen a female be able to achieve this degree of muscle mass without the use of any form of enhancements. And that, doesn't always have to be steroids, but there's usually something involved. Now, for a guy, it's possible that they can sustain a little bit more lean mass naturally than a female could or their other male counterparts. Realistically, they have a hormonal profile built for it and more myonuclei at spawn. They basically have better spawn RNG than any kind of gal would and some other men would. It's, for example, much easier to hit the genetic lottery as a male and sustain better lean mass quantities because of how your genetics and endocrine function is automatically set up. And this is pretty factually true, biologically speaking. That is really how females work. It's why we're bigger, have more bone mineral density at spawn, and generally also have really shitty hairlines. So when you see a jacked guy, it can be likely that he did do this naturally, albeit we live in a world where, unfortunately, that is often far from the actual reality. Most people are just blasting steroids at this point because it's the cool thing to do. What is more likely, though, is when you see a female carrying this much muscle mass this easily, it's less likely that she's natural and more likely that she's depending on some sort of exogenous support to accumulate the amount of lean mass, whilst also being able to get exceptionally lean for show windows. You competing, in bodybuilding, that's what you do. You step on stage, you get hyper lean, and then you bulk back up a bit. But those hyper lean states are actually really interesting when referencing female physiology. Let me just explain why, especially in the context of being super lean, because with several shows under her belt, Hannah should basically have the kind of limit to accruing lean mass. Not to say that she can't continue to grow throughout her life, but she is fairly young. She's in her early 20s. So to briefly explain why this is a bit odd, muscle growth is mostly mediated by androgens. It's an androgen-driven process. Of course, there's many other things, but they play one of the largest roles. Testosterone, for example, binds to androgen receptors in the muscle, ramp up protein synthesis, and drives satellite cells to dump jump into new myonuclei, and that creates more muscle. More myonuclei, more growth signaling, win-win, you get more muscle. Now, women roughly, typically have about 15 to 70 nanograms per deciliter of testosterone. Men, when they're healthy and in good shape, usually produce anywhere from 600 to 1,000 nanograms per deciliter of testosterone. That's not just a small gap, that's a very, very large gap. Now, when we consider that plus the leanness, it's crazy, right? Because leanness makes it worse in a way, not better. Getting stayed shredded means months in an energy deficit, and a deficit is a catabolic environment. Low leptin, suppressing IGF-1, downregulating mTOR. The body throttles down muscle building to conserve fuel, essentially, in a natural individual. And in women, that deficit creates an already tiny androgen output even further tinier, if that made any sense to you at all. So carrying a ton of dense muscle and being peeled for multiple shows, two states that are actively working against you having a large degree of muscle mass, especially as a female. Not to mention, you also have a complex hormonal mechanism that really needs to be tended to as a female when we're talking about amenorrhea and other things like that. And when these things go out of whack, it tends to be the case that your body does too. Physiology stops working as efficiently. Estrogen is in fact anabolic, but we see that this declines in calorie deficits as well. And really, that's the entire mechanical advantage of taking gear. It sustains muscle independently of your energy status. It can grow muscle independently of your energy status. Basically, when you take steroids, you are isolating one mechanism of hypertrophy, which is the steroids themselves, irrespective of training, irrespective of your diet. And this is one of her most viral videos, going well over 1 million views. And I can't help but look at some of the comments here. mthegod723, great odd name, I don't know, explains anyways what I've kind of been thinking. He says, I need to hear her talk to see if she's natty. And I've been thinking that all along, because as I normally do with these types of videos, I scroll to the bottom of her profile and I found nothing. She deleted every single post that she had ever made on Instagram, and her most recent post is only going back to January of this year. Kind of suspicious if you ask me. Now, of course, this could be just some flippant decision to start fresh on your channel, or maybe you're just trying to clear, I don't know, someone like me from going down to your past and seeing, hey, this doesn't look quite the same as it did a year ago, or maybe even 2. And specifically, why would her voice be a clear indication of her being natural or not? Well, this is actually a pretty simple mechanism. Specifically, laryngeal tissue is loaded with androgen receptors, basically just like the rest of your body. Hit it with exogenous androgens, or just excess androgens in general, the vocal folds thicken and lengthen. That exact remodeling is what is happening in a teenage boy during puberty, where they have like those weird Scooby-Doo-like cracks. Lowering fundamental frequencies of the voice, and it gives you sort of a raspier, kind of deeper voice. You drop octaves. Essentially, think of it like a guitar string, right? The smaller guitar string creates a lighter sound, where the thicker guitar string makes a much deeper sound. Now, the reason that this is important is because females don't generally have a ton of androgen signaling to that laryngeal tissue. They don't see vocal folds thickening, they don't see the buildup of edema in vocal folds, and so their voice stays relatively angelic, lightened, and much obviously lighter than a male's voice. But when they do take androgens and they do expose those androgen receptors to signaling, those voices tend to change. And even if they change a very moderate amount from a very low term of exposure of steroids, it is a permanent change. So you will always be able to hear whether a female has been on gear or not, because it does lower their voice. It's not a guarantee, and it's not always 100% of the time going to happen, but it will happen to most females taking steroids if they've taken them at a high enough dose for long enough. And that's really a broad qualification. The high enough dose side of things can be the smallest dose. It just depends on on that individual's predisposition to that androgenic response specifically. So without really having any sort of vocal indications of her sound, it's much harder to say whether she has been virilized, the term that you would use when you're talking about women that are basically overexposed to androgens. It's hard to see that that is the case. And oftentimes what I've noticed is that a lot of gals try to hide this by obfuscating their voices on their content and basically posting anything but them talking. You see this actually on a lot of female bodybuilders' profiles or just females that look oddly good. And the one thing that really pisses me off here, when you scroll through any amount of comments, you always see the people who are trying to cope for their favorite creators because, you know, they competed in a natural federation. They obviously have been tested, bro. You don't know what you're talking about. First of all, brother, look at what we're working with here, all right? What in God's great earth are you talking about? Secondly, this coat fails every single time. Time and time again for the drooling slop consumers of the internet who lack critical thinking skills. I actually talked about this literally just in my last video where we discussed another female influencer who was most likely not natural. For instance, they test for a standard panel, right? Usually this is a urinary metabolite test where they're not necessarily testing for steroids, believe that or not, right? Sometimes they'll tell you that they are actually trying to test for anabolic steroids, and in some more qualified federations, you do see LCMS testing, but really you don't tend to see this in most natural federations. The cost is far too high, and so you get a urinary metabolite test, and basically you can take just about any steroid under the sun and pass that test. But let's just say even theoretically, they did provide you a proper steroid screen and it was scheduled. Well, at this point, every compound has a detection window tied to its ester and metabolites. A water-based suspension, for instance, depending on the compound we're talking about, clears in days. You know, longer esters linger for months and some other metabolites might linger for even more months. But if you're taking oral steroids that have been 17-alkylated, sometimes that clearance is really fast. I mean, within literally a week. So if you know the date that you're getting tested, which all natural federations do testing on the day of the show most of the time, or the day before, there is no randomized testing, you can really easily, and I mean really easily, get your way around the test if they even did a proper test. Really, the only thing that would beat this sort of problem is randomized out-of-competition testing and biological passport tracking of your hormonal profile longitudinally for abnormalities. Essentially, what that means is you're testing frequently throughout a year at random times, and then any time that you see deviations from that person's average baseline hormonal levels, it's a red flag and an indication that maybe more testing should be included for this individual. And the whole polygraph thing is just horrific. Like, anyone could pass a polygraph talking about steroids. It's kind of a dumb method. And I talked about this in the last video as well, but I also competed in natural federations before I started competing in the NPC, or the federation where they don't test you. And I even won my PNBA pro card, okay? I don't say this as a flex. I say this because I too have been tested for steroids before taking gear, and the tests oftentimes don't even test for the metabolites of steroids. I've said this before and I'll say it again. They test for recreational drugs. We talked about this regarding Shizzy because he posted his drug test after competing at a natural federation, and when he showed the drug test, it was only testing for things like fent. Bro was getting tested for fentanyl versus testosterone usage. What good does that really do us? So with these natural federations, again, because the budgets are so limited, there is no randomized testing, there is no serum lab testing, LCMS testing, there is no biological passport developed per athlete. These small, tiny federations just simply don't have the money for that. And even if they do test for urinary metabolites, they're often not even testing for steroids. And rarely do they even have enough money to do the urinary metabolite testing. And in fact, many shows that I have been to with clients who are natural and competing, they don't even test anyone at all. Like, the whole show does not get tested. EHT88 says I was totally on board with this until I read natural in the bio. Those in the gym / bodybuilding space know you're only fooling the Insta athletes. That's a matter of fact. I mean, honestly, if anyone has ever taken gear, you can tell the very clear signs of gear use. In this case, high degrees of vascularity, striations, very large delts that seem to be very abnormal for what would be considered a feminine trait. Beauty and Brawn says, a former gearhead knows a fellow gearhead, but keep telling people you're natty. Yeah, it's kind of like a thing when you're in the scene and you've actually taken gear. It's like you can smell a steroid user from a mile away. Like you just know when someone's busting it down with some trembolone sandwiches in their bathroom. It's like a hidden trait that you develop. It's like a Sharingan that you've just developed after taking steroids. It's like your fucking special curse technique or something. Look, of course, I don't actually know if she's natural or not. I'm just pretty much postulating an idea here. But from my point of view, and definitely the years of time that I've put into bodybuilding and fitness and all this stuff, and the copious amounts of content that I put out there, this just doesn't seem quite right to me. Something seems a little bit off. When you get a video that gets 1.7 million views and almost everyone is calling you out, some red flags may be cropping up. Maybe some randomized drug testing does need to be done on this one individual. But who knows? Maybe she is natural. Maybe she has 1 in 1 billion genetics or whatever Greg Doucette tries to cope with to say that his athletes are natural. Who knows?